In the 1950s and 60s, the US and the USSR jockeyed for dominance in the space and atomic races. It was a game of one-upmanship on a grand scale. Who could build the deadliest atomic weapon? Who could launch the first satellite? And who could get to the moon? But the Americans and Soviets were not the only ones competing for atomic might and glory in space. Britain, too, was anxious to build up her arsenal and explore the mysteries of outer space. Years were spent developing a homegrown system for launching atomic weapons and satellites. But days before Britain's own Prospero satellite lifted into the heavens on board her own Black Arrow rocket, the launch program was cancelled altogether. In World War II, Germany developed sophisticated weaponized rockets that could strike the Allies at will. There were no countermeasures for a V-2 rocket streaming down from the skies and blasting holes in the neighbourhoods of London. Once launched, no interceptors were fast enough to reach them. The only way to stop them was to destroy them on the launch pad, or even better, wipe out Germany's ability to manufacture them in the first place. The Soviets and the Americans, recognizing the potential of rockets, were eager to seize the science and technology behind them for themselves. A Soviet rocket program had been put on ice at the start of the war, and Stalin was eager to reignite it.
The Russians had made a tremendous amount of developmental study in the late 1930s, but the Stalin purges stripped Russia of the ability to keep up, and so they went into a period of stagnation during the war, while the Germans accelerated with some very keen brains that had been working long-range rockets like the V-2.
At war's end, both sides scavenged Germany for the keys to these weapons. The remnants of German science and the men behind it that had survived the relentless bombing raids were systematically collected as the Allies advanced. For the next few years, the experimentation that went on behind the Iron Curtain remained largely a secret. In the early 1950s, German scientists, who had been captured by the Soviets, began the long journey home. They had chilling news for the Allies about the mysterious activities in the Soviet Union. The world knew that the Soviets had atomic weapons, and the Soviets flexed their atomic muscles by testing their first bomb, First Lightning, on August 29, 1949, a bomb similar in operation to the one that had devastated Nagasaki. With each passing year, the Soviets detonated ever larger atomic weapons. To the dismay of the Allies, the freed German rocket scientists revealed that the Soviets had made rapid progress in missile technology. At war's end, they had captured the V-2 production facility at Nordhausen. There were 30 complete examples of rockets there, as well as many of the scientists and engineers in charge of the site. By 1947, the Soviets were manufacturing copies of the V-2, the R-1, and they were well on their way to building longer-range weapons. It would only be a matter of time before they combined rocket and nuclear technology into the deadliest of weapons. Long and short-range missiles armed with atomic warheads that could set whole cities ablaze at the whim of the Soviet leadership. Truman, looking to control nuclear proliferation, had been unwilling to share nuclear technology with Britain, even though she had been a significant part of the Manhattan Project, and the two nations had a common foe in the Soviet Union. In 1952, Britain proved she too was a nuclear power. It was then that she detonated her first nuclear weapon at Tremoy Island in Australia. With a nuclear attack looming, a V-bomber force was assembled capable of striking the Soviets. However, even with Britain's autonomous nuclear capability and bombers, Churchill recognized he would need the help of the Americans to deal with the growing Soviet threat. He hoped President Eisenhower would be a more generous atomic partner.
When Churchill went to America, he established a renewed relationship about cooperation on atomic weapons. Britain wanted what it called the Moscow Card, the ability to destroy and decapitate the Soviet leadership. It had structured its V-bomber force specifically on that capability. And so the range of the missile that Britain aspired to have was far beyond its capabilities in terms of indigenous research and tests that it had done. So it needed both the cooperation of the United States to assist back in with development of an atomic bomb, and it also needed help with the development of rocket motors for this aspirational long-range ballistic missile.
In 1954, Duncan Sands, the UK Minister of Supply, and his counterpart in the US, Secretary of Defense Charles Wilson, agreed that the two nations should work together to build up an arsenal of ballistic missiles as a deterrent to the Soviet threat. It was hoped that the Soviets wouldn't dare launch their own strike if they knew an equally potent atomic attack would fall upon them in return. The US was tasked with developing a long-range intercontinental ballistic missile known as the Atlas. Britain was unable to buy missiles directly from the US due to the restrictions of the 1946 Atomic Energy Act, and began development of her own medium-range weapon, to be known as the Blue Streak missile.
The interesting thing about why assistance was so important to the Americans is that until the end of the 1950s, the Americans were unable to demonstrate a truly intercontinental ballistic missile capability, one that would have a range of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 miles. But they were producing missiles like the Thor and the Jupiter, which would have a range of about 1,500 miles. And that was exactly perfect for the UK. So coming along, they could bleed technology they already were developing for their own medium-range ballistic missiles, 1,500-mile range, to slot that capability in, give it to Britain, and have that as a front line, front trench against potential Soviet aggression.
Putting the long-range project in American hands made sense. Geographically, home-based missiles would have to travel a much longer distance to get from America to the USSR than from England. More importantly, the US had deeper pockets to construct such weapons and greater experience in missile testing. Like the Soviets, they had poached Germany's greatest minds to unlock the secrets of her most powerful weapons. Under Operation Paperclip, Wernher von Braun, the genius behind the V-2 rocket, was brought to the United States. The Americans were willing to overlook his involvement in the Nazi Party and his use of slave labour, if it meant they could get an edge in the Cold War that was brewing. Working with the US Army, he and much of his old staff from Germany helped provide the V-2 missile program. As part of Project Hermes, using V-2 rockets collected from Germany, von Braun helped America pick up where Germany had left off. The British had also had the opportunity to test-fire V-2 rockets and study German research, but they still had a steep curve to climb to catch up to the Americans in rocket development. Although they had felt the devastation wrought by the V-2s, they were initially more interested in Germany's shorter-range weapons.
In Britain, it was believed that the German research on smaller-scale rockets would more immediately bring a greater benefit. Air-to-air missiles for air defence, and also rocket-assisted takeoff units for existing jet-powered aircraft. The alcohol and liquid oxygen of the V-2 was not seen as a progressive step for Britain because the country immediately after the war was not in a position to be able to invest in those big-scale technology projects.
De Havilland and Rolls-Royce worked together to develop Britain's Blue Streak missile. De Havilland had created the Comet, the Vampire, and the Fire Streak air-to-air missile, and they would use their aerodynamic expertise to build the missile's body, while legendary engine manufacturer Rolls-Royce would focus on the Blue Streak's rocket engines. The Blue Streak was powered by an engine with American heritage. The RZ-2 was essentially an uprated version of a rocket engine designed by North American Aviation and originally fitted in the Navajo cruise missile.
The Rocketdyne Company in America, a division of North American Aviation, was already churning out rocket motors of 150,000 pound thrust. They cooperated with the British in delivering to Rolls-Royce that capability. So Rolls-Royce took two of those engines, married them up into the Rolls-Royce RZ-2 to produce the 300,000 pound thrust of its long-range ballistic missile, Blue Streak.
Unlike the German V2s, which were propelled by a mixture of ethanol and water, oxidized by liquid oxygen, the Blue Streak engine used kerosene and liquid oxygen as propellants. One major question that still needed to be answered was how the nuclear warhead would react upon re-entry into the atmosphere. Rather than work out this issue on costly Blue Streak missiles, a smaller rocket was developed specifically for the purpose. It was known as the Black Knight.
Britain got a lot of information about this miniaturization of nuclear warheads from the Americans, but it had to develop its own re-entry vehicles, RVs as they're called. There was a need to produce a quick and dirty test vehicle to throw a warhead up out of the atmosphere, drive it down, to test the materials that would have to survive the enormous heat from friction with the atmosphere, as re-entering warheads would at the end of a ballistic missile flight to its target in the event of war. And that was challenging even the American machine, which had vastly greater assets and resources at this time.
The Black Knight was tested by Saunders Roe on the chalky cliffs on the western tip of the Isle of Wight. The 19th century fort there, built to defend England from incoming invaders, was transformed into one of the most sophisticated research facilities in the world. It was no small task. The terrain was radically altered. 10,000 pounds of chalk had to be shuffled into Scratchell's Bay. The resulting white scars had to be covered over with turf to prevent dust from whirling up during engine tests. Hundreds of electric cables for instrumentation and general service were laid under the newly paved roads. Raymond Wheeler, chief designer of the Black Knight, recalls the layout of this space-age facility.
There were two sites where the whole rocket could be test-fired, and those two buildings were spread out sideways, and in between was a control room for setting everything in train.
Rockets wouldn't actually be launched from the Isle. This was a test facility only. A duplicate site was built in Woomera, Australia, to send the rockets into space.
Well, Highdown was where we set the rocket up and just tested that all the control systems worked. At Woomera, we actually fired the rocket. And the reason for the difference was just safety. If something went wrong when you fired out of the needles, it could have landed anywhere, even Southampton.
The body of the Black Knight rocket was manufactured at the Saunders Roe Works in East Cowes, also on the Isle of Wight, while engine development took place at the Bristol Siddeley Works at Anstey near Coventry. Saunders Roe had already built an aircraft powered by a jet and a rocket engine.
I was working for Saunders Roe at the time when this all began, and we were building a mixed unit fighter aircraft called the SR-53. So we were experienced in designing rocket installations.
Black Knight was a tall, slender rocket, about 10 meters from base to tip, with a 1 meter diameter, about half the height and a third of the width of the Blue Streak. It could carry a 115 kilogram payload only, 10 times less than its big brother from de Havilland. The Black Knight initially used Gamma 201 rocket engines. These were liquid fuel engines with kerosene and high-test peroxide, HTP, a concentrated form of hydrogen peroxide, as propellants. HTP is a highly volatile substance first used by the Germans to launch their rocket-powered Comet interceptors in World War II. Special precautions and protective clothing were necessary to handle it. If splashed on the skin or clothing, it could result in a burn or even a fire. Each of the 4 rocket engines had about 4,000 pounds of thrust, or 16,000 pounds combined.
So these were relatively small engines. These were engines the size of which the Americans were putting in the back of aircraft to test them through the sound barrier and on up to Mark II and Mark III. So while they were using very volatile propellant combinations, the thrust themselves was really quite small.
Still, it was deemed to be powerful enough to propel the Black Knight several hundred miles above the Earth, above the atmosphere, and into space. Improvements in later model Gamma 301 engines elevated thrust to over 21,000 pounds. The rocket was controlled in flight by swiveling the motors, which changed the angle of thrust. To increase stability in the air, the Black Knight was fitted with 4 fins. Pods at the ends of the fins contained electronics to help the Saunders Roe creation on its journey into space. Additional instruments were housed in the nose cone, which separated from the rocket in flight and recorded what happened as it re-entered the atmosphere and fell to Earth. Once the engines were fitted and the rocket complete, it was transported down to the High Down test site. The Black Knight needed a passing grade from High Down before it could get a ticket for a space trip. Every aspect of an actual launch was replicated, and it was almost as dangerous.
The kinetic energy in an exploding rocket stage is considerable, and so the dangers attendant are colossal. It was a major step to have the test facility there and go through all of the processes except liftoff, but every single step and potential danger, as you would have actually at the launch site down in Australia.
The last 2 minutes of the launch were entirely automated. In the operations room, the sequence officer ensured that all connections were correct before locking up the unit. A red flag, hoisted outside, signalled that the site was active and a launch pending. The assistant safety officer checked that all was clear in the gantry. The firing circuits were signalled as ready, the main safety links were inserted, and the safety officer gave the all clear. At -2 minutes, the automated launch sequence kicked in. A red light came on, and Black Knight was alive. Every aspect of the test was recorded in the instrumentation room. Tape recorders, galvanometers, oscilloscopes, telemetry displays, and film allowed scientists to study every detail of the test. The rocket was put through its paces. The motors executed a pre-programmed pattern of movement to test yaw, pitch and roll. Everything went as planned, and the rocket engines were shut down. It was a small triumph for everyone at Saunders Roe and Bristol Siddeley, but Black Knight's main glory was still to come. An actual launch in Woomera. As the British edged ever closer to launching Blue Streak and the Black Knight rockets, the US continued testing their own Atlas ICBM. This was a liquid-fueled rocket burning liquid oxygen and kerosene, just like the Blue Streak. In June of 1957, the Atlas was ready for launch. If successful, the US would have had the world's first ICBM. The launch, however, ended in disaster. After a promising start, the rocket tumbled into the air and fell back to the Earth. It was a major embarrassment for the US, but things got even worse for the superpower. A month later, the Soviets announced that they had successfully launched their own ICBM, the R-7 Semyorka. There were serious doubts in the West that the Soviets were capable of such a feat, and the thinking was that it was pure propaganda only. On October 4, 1957, they gave the world all the proof they needed. On that day, the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite into outer space. The pulsing, silvery beacon circling the globe was a constant reminder the Soviets had the edge in the space race. Sputnik was also a warning that it was only a matter of time before they could replace the satellite module with a nuclear warhead. It became ever more critical to the West to develop their own nuclear missiles.
The launch of Sputnik produced hysteria in the United States and a deep intake of breath across continental Europe and the UK. It's very interesting that the United States Information Agency, the USIA, through its embassies across continental Europe and in the UK, did a rapid survey of public opinion. And immediately after Sputnik, most countries in Europe, particularly France, thought that this had rewritten the balance of technological superiority and shifted it from the United States to the Soviet Union.
Back on the Isle of Wight, the Black Knight had passed all tests and was deemed fit for launch. It was packed in 2,000-pound crates, built by Saunders Roe, with special features to prevent moisture build-up on the long 14,000-mile trip to Woomera, Australia. On the 7th September 1958, the team from Saunders Roe and Bristol Siddeley finally discovered if all their years of hard work would pay off. The Black Knight was ready for launch. It carried no payload, as this was a general test of the rocket's equipment and the entire launch procedure. For several long moments, the scientists and engineers must have held their breaths as the clock ticked down. An explosion could have meant the loss of months of work and a black mark of the project. As the Black Knight streaked into the air, the teams from both British companies rejoiced. Britain had taken a giant step in the space race. America too had made great strides in ballistic missile development. The Redstone rocket was a direct descendant of the V-2 and had been created under the guidance of von Braun. It was a short-range surface-to-surface missile with a strike distance between 100 and 330 kilometers. Like the V-2, this was a liquid-fuel rocket which burned a mixture of water and alcohol with liquid oxygen. In August of 1958, a nuclear-tipped Redstone rocket was launched from the remote island of Johnston Atoll. When it reached 76.8 kilometers, the 3.8 megaton warhead on board detonated in an awesome explosion. The Americans had a deadly new nuclear weapon in their arsenal. However, just like with the atomic bomb, the Americans knew they could not hold a monopoly on it forever. On October 4, 1957, the Soviets stunned the world by sending Sputnik into space. As the Americans watched the night sky above them, that pulsing beacon heralded the creation of new devastating Soviet weapons. Virtually indefensible long-range nuclear missiles capable of striking anywhere in the world. The Americans and the British were scurrying to build a defensive nuclear shield against such an attack, sometimes with mixed results. The Blue Streak missile would have given Britain a weapon to decapitate the Soviet leadership, but they needed a reliable system for delivering the warheads. This same technology would propel Britain into the space race. The culmination of her efforts came to fruition in 1971. It was then that she dared to put her own satellite into orbit with a homegrown rocket. As test launches continued with the Black Knight, the re-entry vehicle for Blue Streak's nuclear warhead was perfected. Experiments took place on moonless nights, so the luminous wake of re-entry could be photographed more easily. Afterwards, scientists scoured the Woomera terrain for remnants of the rocket for further analysis. In later tests, a second stage, propelled by a solid rocket motor, hurtled the head towards the Earth after the rocket reached the peak of its ascent. This was essentially preparation for firing nuclear warheads at enemy targets. At the same time, the Black Knight's big brother, the Blue Streak, was facing trouble. The Blue Streak rocket had a paper-thin stainless steel skin to make it as light as possible. It was so thin that the rocket needed to be constantly pressurized to keep the structure from collapsing in on itself. This slowed down manufacturing tremendously. By 1960, the Blue Streak still wasn't ready, and the cost of completing the project was pegged at between 550 million and 1.3 billion pounds. There were also fears that even if the Blue Streak was completed, it would be vulnerable to a preemptive Soviet strike.
There was a consolidated awareness that, in fact, the Blue Streak that had been agreed in 1953 and was still very much on its way toward final development and test would be very vulnerable, because what Sputnik said to the informed, which rapidly got to the man in the street through the media, was the fact that this did not represent anything vital in terms of a little bleeping ball going around the Earth, but the rocket that launched it was now capable of sending a nuclear warhead to any target anywhere on Earth from Soviet territory.
Each Blue Streak contained 80 tons of liquid nitrogen, but the frigid liquid could not be stored in the rocket long term. Otherwise it would ice up. It took a full 30 minutes to fuel up and prep a Blue Streak for a launch. Undoubtedly, the Blue Streak could be vaporized before it lifted off by incoming Soviet missiles. De Havilland suggested pairing the missiles and alternating which was ready for launch to minimize icing, but this would have been a logistical headache and doubled the number of missiles needed to create a defensive grid. As well, there were plans for burying the launch pads in silos to shield the missiles from bomb blasts. The proposed silos would have withstood a 1 megaton bomb blast from half a mile away. However, it would have cost millions of pounds to dig out and construct them in great numbers and suitable sites. There were also social and political ramifications. The average Brit would not feel comfortable with a silo in their backyard. With costs, complications and criticism piling up, it's no surprise that the Blue Streak was cancelled in 1960 when a cheaper alternative appeared from across the Atlantic. Nuclear missile launch sites were static and made for an easy target. But what if an aircraft could be adapted to deliver and fire these weapons? America had moved away from nuclear bombers because they were vulnerable to attack by surface-to-air missiles and interceptors. Next, they moved towards missiles. But once an ICBM was launched, unlike a bomber, it could not be recalled all redirected. Negotiations and peace were off the table. The GAM-87 Skybolt was an attempt at getting the best of both worlds, the flexibility of a nuclear bomber and the invulnerability of a nuclear missile. The Skybolt was an air-launched nuclear missile developed by American aircraft manufacturer Douglas. The plan was to equip B-52s and British V-bombers with this 1 megaton weapon.
The Americans offered Skybolt as an air-launched ballistic missile, which would do the job of Blue Streak, but carried under the fuselage of a Vulcan V-bomber. These were storable weapons that could be lifted off the runway by Vulcans on call following standby. And they had the range of Blue Streak, 1,500 miles. And they would soar out into space 300 miles and dive down just exactly the same as a ballistic missile launched from the ground. So they did the same job, except that they took away targets in the UK, which otherwise would have been targets for Soviet missiles, as the launch sites for Blue Streak, took them away. The airfields for the V-bombers were always going to be nuclear targets. Russians were always going to strike those. But the Vulcans would be gone with their Skybolts, and that's why Skybolt was considered.
The British already had a similar weapon, the Blue Steel missile. However, the GAM-87 promised superior range, enabling bombers to loiter on the edge of Soviet territory. Once given the signal to attack, the bombers could fire the Skybolt into enemy territory, confident that the missile, travelling at over 1,500 kilometers per hour, could deliver a knockout punch. If the strike was designed to knock out defences, the bomber might have a secondary mission, dropping free-fall bombs against additional targets in the Soviet Union. Britain put full confidence in the Skybolt. It was in fact to be her only nuclear deterrent. However, the entire Skybolt program was soon vaporized itself. The US had other superior nuclear weapons in development, including the Polaris and Minutemen missiles. The Polaris missile could be launched from submarines lurking in the depths of the ocean, giving the US mobility and the element of surprise. Minutemen missiles were much more accurate than earlier ballistic missiles, as they had a flight computer on board. There was no problem with having them ready for launch at a minute's notice, as they were solid rockets and did not use liquid nitrogen, which caused icing issues on missiles like the Blue Streak. With these two exceptional weapons available, the Skybolt was deemed expendable, and in 1962 Kennedy officially cancelled the whole program. But what of Britain, who had placed all her bets on the Skybolt? There was outrage in the House of Commons. The UK was left out in the cold, with no nuclear deterrent and with the Soviets practically on its doorstep. An emergency meeting was called between President Kennedy and Prime Minister Macmillan in the Bahamas. The two would hammer out the Nassau Agreement, which guaranteed the UK a supply of Polaris missiles in exchange for leasing a submarine base to the Americans in the Holy Loch, near Glasgow.
The British electorate, when they learned that Polaris was offered in place of Skybolt, were furious over the fact that it seemed to put the lie to the fact that we had an independent nuclear deterrent. And the House of Commons erupted over the fact that suddenly the country was being told by the Americans, you can't have this system because we cancel it, but you can have that. And it seemed as though the Americans were pulling our strings, that the British were in fact puppets of America's nuclear war machine. And so when Polaris was offered, while it made huge sense for the British and offered the British the ability to actually retire the V-bomber aircraft force and have a single offshore nuclear deterrent where there were no targets with nuclear capability operating from UK soil, that nevertheless forever and resonates today with the fact that Britain is reliant on the American missiles, which of course they are, through Poseidon that replaced Polaris and Trident that replaced Poseidon.
The UK had filled their need for a nuclear deterrent, but they had already invested so much time, energy and money into Blue Streak and Black Knight. Was there a way to salvage something of value out of their cancelled rocket programs? In 1962, the Soviets and Americans led the world in the space race. They were neck and neck, spending millions of dollars, and as the months went by, each one was clearly doing everything they could to get the upper hand. But the Soviets always seemed to be a step ahead. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin of the Soviet Union became the first man in space. Less than a month later, astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space. Though a remarkable achievement for NASA, it was still an embarrassment for Kennedy. The US, with all its money and industrial might, was still coming in second place. On May 25th, Kennedy challenged his country to go where no man or woman had gone before.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
The UK was still making its own strides in space exploration, and in 1962 they launched the first in a series of aerial satellites. The US was instrumental in all of the launches. They not only provided the rockets, they often constructed the satellites to the specification of British researchers. Each aerial satellite conducted a unique set of experiments, examining phenomena like cosmic rays and solar radiation. It was a great accomplishment for Britain. Only two other countries had their own satellites, namely the Soviets and the US. But it was only possible with American assistance. Britain actually had a successful shorter-range rocket system built on her earlier work with V-2 rockets, called the Skylark.
In Britain, because of the amount of information that the British got from German research, the kind of technologies that were being developed for air-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, those made the British able to develop a generation of rockets that were used called sounding rockets, for putting sounding probes into the upper atmosphere and into space. And emerging out of one of the most amazing developments from British industry was a very powerful sounding rocket called Skylark. And from 1957 to the 1990s, more than 440 were launched, carrying payloads for scientists and experimenters and institutes and universities all over the world.
Some believed that the UK could get all the way into space independently, with a royal rocket of their own. The Black Prince was essentially a Blue Streak missile with the Black Knight mounted on top, and a solid rocket as the third and final stage. The idea was initially put forward in 1957. The same year, Sputnik had gone into space. This princely proposal was revisited in 1960, following the cancellation of the Blue Streak missile. However, the Prince did not have a long reign. Money, as always, was a key issue for the UK government, and they could not find any other backers in the Commonwealth to support the project. The Black Prince was abandoned in favour of a joint space venture with France, several other European countries, and Australia. This new space organisation was ELDO, or the European Launcher Development Programme. They hoped that by sharing the costs and technology, they could make space research and development affordable.
Well, ELDO, the European Launcher Development Organisation, was essentially at the inspiration and instigation of the British. They went to France and to Germany, which had robust propulsion technology programs. There was an indigenous German rocket capability from the Second World War. The companies that had built all of the infrastructure for the V2s and the prolific German rocket program, that was all there. The paperwork and the knowledge and the know-how and the legacy went to the victorious powers in 1945. But Germany held on to a tremendous attraction for rocket technology. And so it was to France and Germany, France with its already robust national satellite program developing, with its rocket program called Diamond, coming out of its sounding rocket program, sending up packages of instruments on ballistic hops above the stratosphere to get information about near-Earth space and the outer atmosphere. So France was a good deal, a good stop-off on the way to Germany to ask for a tripartite discussion that maybe could bring in other European partners. Let's all fund it together. And by the way, here is Blue Streak, big, powerful first stage, bigger than anything else around and on the block at the time.
Eldo's primary task was getting into space successfully, and building the Eldo A rocket was a top priority. The Eldo A, later named the Europa 1, was a 3-stage rocket, with the Blue Streak occupying stage 1, just like the Black Prince. The rest of the work was divided amongst Eldo's partners. France provided the second stage, the Karelia, and West Germany, the final one, the Astris. Italy worked on the actual satellite project, while the Netherlands and Belgium developed tracking and telemetry systems, and Australia supplied the launch site. In the coming years, much progress was made. Between 1964 and 1972, the Blue Streak was tested multiple times as part of the Eldo project in various Europa rockets. It was also in 1964 that the outgoing Conservative government made an unexpected move. Although they were thoroughly invested in Eldo and the Europa 1, the government approved the RAE's proposal for another launcher system. Britain was to fire its own satellites into space aboard Black Arrows.
But the British were already aware that they could produce, and British technologists and manufacturing firms were aware that they could produce from existing Black Knight gamma engine technology, the gamma engines that have been used in the Black Knight test rocket for Blue Streak. They could put together multiples of these and create a multi-stage satellite launcher. And so that proceeded, and Black Arrow was developed with very low funding to gradually work its way toward the capability of an independent British satellite launch vehicle.
The RAE were keen on launching satellites to test emerging technologies. One area of interest was ion engines, engines which expel ions for thrust. This propulsion system would allow spacecraft, satellites and deep space probes to travel further, faster and more cheaply than any other system available. The Black Arrow was a direct descendant of the Black Knight. Much of the staff from Saunders-Roe's initial project were transferred to the Black Arrow. Westlands became the primary contractor when Saunders-Roe merged with the company in 1964, while Bristol Siddeley was still responsible for the engines. The project faced some early hurdles. It was initially put on hold by an incoming Labour government looking to reduce expenditures. Work resumed 2 years later after the 1966 election. The new government gave the green light to a scaled-down version of the project with fewer launches. However, footing a large portion of the bill for a secondary launch system, Eldo's Europa rocket was just too expensive for the cash-conscious government.
Europa was proceeding on technologically sound lines toward the production of a European satellite launcher. The cost of it was increasing, and the British government decided to pull out. That incensed the French to the point where they went it alone and produced the Ariane launch vehicle, which today is launching half the world's satellite traffic.
Britain still maintained a role in the Europa development, though, in a greatly diminished capacity, while she focused on her own homegrown rocket. The Black Arrow was back on track, with a launch date expected in 1968. Its first stage had exactly the same diameter as the Karelia, the second stage of the Europa rocket. This was intentional. It gave Britain a backup for the Karelia and allowed the possibility of stacking the Black Arrow on top of the Blue Streak, thus creating an even more powerful rocket. Black Arrow's first test launch was on June 28, 1969 in Woomera, Australia. This was to be a test for the first and second stages only. It was far too risky to send up a satellite this early in the program. This was a wise decision. There was an electrical problem that caused the combustion chamber to pivot back and forth. The rocket rolled erratically after clearing the launch pad. After the first stage failed completely, the Black Arrow fell back to Earth and was detonated by launch officials. It wasn't the start the researchers had hoped for.
The test problems were essentially based upon the fact that this was a much bigger rocket. And it's not easy just to simply say, OK, we'll just put more at the base and have a bigger rocket. There were all kinds of complex problems that evolved from that.
Less than 3 weeks later, NASA wrote a new chapter in space exploration history. For the first time, a human walked on the moon. The Apollo 11 crew of Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins and Buzz Aldrin took this fantastic voyage aboard a Saturn V rocket. A rocket designed in large part by Wernher von Braun. America had won the race to the moon, but it was a great achievement to be shared by all of humankind. The success of Apollo 11 must have been inspiring to the Black Arrow's team. Fortunately, the Black Arrow's early failure did not leave a black mark on its career, and tests resumed. The early bugs were ironed out of the system, and the second launch went up without a hitch. It was time to see if the Black Arrow could put a satellite into orbit. The third arrow in the quiver was set to launch on the 2nd of September 1970. It had a promising start. Stage 1 burnt and separated successfully. However, an oxidizer leak in Stage 2 meant that rocket could not reach orbit. This would be the most costly failure for the program. In July of 1971, the entire Black Arrow program was cancelled.
We were used to our government cancelling projects. At Saunders Row we were working on a mixed unit fighter aircraft, which is a wonderful aircraft, and that was just cancelled. If they couldn't afford something, they just cancelled it. No problem to them at all.
As with all of Britain's earlier rocket programs, money was the main issue. It was deemed too costly for Britain to build her own rockets. Private sector launches would have been one way for the government to recoup some of its investment. However, the Black Arrow could carry a small 100-kilogram payload only, and was not suitable for launching commercial satellites, which were getting larger and more complicated. Furthermore, Britain did not have an ideal launch site for putting objects into orbit.
Woomera is a very good test area, but it's not very good for launching satellites that may have a commercial application, because you need to launch from close to the equator. The Americans, being relatively close to the equator with Cape Canaveral, 28 degrees north, that's all, you have to give them the advantage there.
William Penny, best known as the father of Britain's atomic program, was asked to evaluate the Black Arrow project. His recommendations may have been the death knell for the Arrow. Black Arrow has no alternative use, and the nation would have much to gain and little to lose if it were cancelled in favour of American launchers. We would be abandoning a certain political independence and a guarantee of commercial security payments, but on these 2 points, satisfactory safeguards should be available from the US authorities. America had been to the moon and back, and it would have been no great feat for them to put future British satellites into orbit on board their scout rockets. NASA had even offered to launch British payloads for free, an offer which was ultimately withdrawn. It seemed as if Britain might never launch a satellite into orbit on her own. Britain's involvement with Eldo was equally unfruitful. By June 12, 1970, there had been 10 launches of Europa rockets, with 4 successes, 1 terminated launch, and 5 failures. Unfortunately, all the attempts at satellite launches had been unsuccessful. Britain still had one last chance to put her own satellite into space. That is, if the Black Arrow could somehow fire a puck into orbit. The Prospero satellite, also known as the X-3, and the puck, was designed to conduct experiments on telecommunication satellite components. It was a British-made satellite, and the 4th Black Arrow rocket was slated to bring it into space. Though the Black Arrow project had been cancelled, the rocket had already been shipped to the Australian launch site. So close to success, the Black Arrow team defied the government's decision. Still waiting for the formal cancellation orders to arrive, Technical Director Raymond Wheeler decided to give it one more go. With scientists and engineers monitoring their controls, the launch clock ticked down. Ignition. Out of a cloud of smoke, the Black Arrow rose into the sky like a phoenix out of the flame. Prospero was successfully released and began broadcasting a steady signal as it circled around the globe. The Black Arrow had finally hit the mark. It was a great success at long last for Britain and her space program, though it was, in some ways, an embarrassment to the British government, as the Black Arrow engineers had just proven them wrong in spectacular fashion. The Black Arrow team had much for which to rejoice. Though they had overcome considerable adversity, for Technical Director Raymond Wheeler, it was just another day at the office.
This was just routine, ordinary work to us. We expected it to work, and it did.
It was a bittersweet victory. Operations were shut down on the Isle of Wight, and Saunders Roe shuttered their rocket launch program. Many scientists and engineers were let go and would have to look elsewhere to pursue their dreams of space. Though the Black Arrow program was laid to rest, from its ashes, Britain would emerge as a leader in satellite technology.
The launch of Prospero was a huge boost, a tremendous fillip, emotionally and technologically. We had now probed every aspect of what it was to be a spacefaring nation. Rockets, guidance and control systems, propulsion systems, handling and test, all of those things associated with getting a rocket working. Manufacturing and building a satellite completely without the help of anybody else, and having it attached to a vehicle so that it could separate and operate and continue to send scientific results from space. That was really all that industry needed. And from that point, industry invested, consolidated, worked its way back into the satellite programs of Europe and globally to become one of the largest providers today in this new century of satellite manufacturers around the world. And as part of a European consortium, it has returned to the very market that it's turned its back on with the cancellation of Blue Streak and the removal of that rocket as the first stage of Europa, which itself gave birth to Ariane. So while Britain is no longer in the propulsion business, Prospero began a line of development that saw this country one of the biggest manufacturing producers of high-tech satellites in the world.
Here, on the Isle of Wight, only a few remnants remain of Britain's indigenous rocket program. The sophisticated launch facility is now largely in ruins, just like the old fort that preceded it. Still, the significance of the rocket program has not been erased by time. It lives on in the armada of British satellites circling the globe, including Prospero itself. It may have been deactivated in 1996, but it remains a beacon of that one triumphant day in 1971.
Britain's nuclear V-force reached its operational zenith by 1964. If necessary, more than 150 Valiants, Victors, and Vulcans could be quickly deployed from makeshift airfields across the British Isles. The aircraft could be airborne within 4 minutes, armed with a blue steel nuclear missile. A single aircraft possessed the capability to deliver a devastating strike deep within the heart of the Soviet Union. This was the era of QRA, Quick Reaction Alert. The Royal Air Force Bomber Command reached its peak in terms of size and strength during the final months of the Second World War. Night after night, hundreds of Lancaster and Halifax heavy bombers were dispatched to pummel the German homeland with millions of tons of bombs. Collaborating closely with the U.S. Air Force, the Allied bomber formations systematically devastated industrial, civilian, and military centers, playing a pivotal role in the ultimate victory in Europe. But the cost was high. Even though they were heavily armored and equipped with defensive weapons, the heavy bombers still remained susceptible to attacks. Conversely, the de Havilland Mosquito exhibited remarkably high levels of survivability, even though it was completely unarmed. The key lay in its ability to fly at high speed at altitudes that put it beyond the German defenses. In 1945, as the Allies advanced across Western Europe and into Germany, numerous aircraft research facilities fell into their hands. American, British, and Russian scientists all stood to gain immensely from the data obtained from the Germans, as they would delve into every facet of aeronautical design. Of particular interest with the advances in turbojet and wing technology. The Messerschmitt 262 had been the world's first jet bomber, even though it was designed as a fighter. It turned out to be entirely unsuitable for bombing missions, as it couldn't carry a sufficient payload to inflict substantial damage. However, as a fighter aircraft, it could outperform any other aircraft operated by the Allied air forces. Swept wings, just like those on the 262, would become standard features for years to come. The Germans had also experimented with the delta wing design through the Messerschmitt 163 Comet interceptor. These, along with other aircraft such as the Arado 234, collectively indicated that aircraft design was on a verge of a new era. Meanwhile, the war in the Far East was at risk of grinding towards a stalemate. Despite the impending invasion of their homeland, the Japanese refused to surrender and even resorted to suicide attacks against American ships. Then, on August 6, 1945, a single Boeing B-29 Superfortress, flying at an altitude of 32,000 feet, released an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. The device was a free-fall bomb timed to detonate at 1,900 feet above ground level, with a power equivalent to 12,500 tons of TNT. 3 days later, a bomb with a power equivalent to 22,000 tons of TNT was dropped on Nagasaki. Japan quickly surrendered, and the Second World War was over. In an instant, the age-old debates about what defines strategic power became glaringly clear thanks to the nuclear bomb. As peace emerged, there were inevitable reductions in military expenditures, even though there remained concerns about Soviet intentions in Europe and the Far East. Demobilization provided a natural means of reducing numbers of RAF personnel, but other cutbacks would hurt much more. Production contracts and in particular aeronautic research projects were either drastically cut back or cancelled. Britain's lead in aeronautics and air engine design, which it had enjoyed at the war's conclusion, was nearly obliterated within a year. For Bomber Command, this meant that the Avro Lincoln, which had succeeded the Lancaster, would need to remain in service into the 1950s. However, the Lincoln belonged to a bygone era. Not only was it slower in comparison to the emerging jet bombers, but it also had limited range and, most crucially, lacked the capacity to carry a nuclear bomb. As a solution to this last problem, Bomber Command was to be equipped with Boeing B-29s, leased from the Americans. Whilst it was undoubtedly capable of carrying an atom bomb, it was still a Second World War bomber, and not the kind of aircraft the RAF needed to take into the nuclear era. However, amid this otherwise gloomy picture, a ray of hope emerged. The RAF had the distinction of being the first Allied Air Force to operate a jet-powered aircraft, the Gloucester Meteor. While the initial performance of the early Meteors left much to be desired, they nonetheless offered the RAF invaluable experience in jet flight. The Air Ministry was resolute in its determination to introduce a jet bomber into service as swiftly as possible. Even before the war's end, a new specification was issued for a light bomber propelled by twin jet engines, intended to serve as a successor to the Mosquito. The result was the English Electric Canberra, which would go on to serve the RAF and US Air Force for over 40 years. Although a relatively conventional design with truck-unswept wings, it could still fly at a speed and altitude beyond the reach of any of the jet fighters of the day. However, the aircraft specified for the task could not only carry a payload of 6,000 pounds of bombs, falling short of the Bomber's Command's need for the capacity to carry nuclear weapons weighing 10,000 pounds. As a result, in January 1947, additional specifications were issued, demanding aircraft with the capability to penetrate the enemy defenses at high altitudes, evade interception through their jet-powered and high-speed performance, and if required, deliver a nuclear weapon. Despite the spending cuts, the British aviation community was led by men of extraordinary vision and entrepreneurial spirit. Men like George Edwards at Vickers, Roy Chadwick with the support of Sir Roy Dobson at Avro, Reginald Strafford and Geoffrey Lee in the employment of Sir Frederick Handley Page of Handley Page fame, shared an intense rivalry that proved as fruitful as it was fierce.
At one stage, and I can't recall exactly when this happened, Handley Page design team and Avro design team decided that it would be worthwhile them comparing notes about the Vulcan and the Victor and trying to achieve the best result for the country as a whole. And a meeting was actually formed at Cricklewood with Avro designers attending and discussing, or starting at the beginning of the meeting to discuss the merits of each other's designs, when Sir Roy Dobson at Avro's found out what was going on, because he wanted to see one of the people that turned out to be Radlett, and he said, or at Cricklewood, he said, what's he doing at Cricklewood? Discussing the Vulcan with Handley Page was the answer. He said, get him on the phone and bring all those people back instantly. And the meeting was stopped at about a quarter of the way through, I understand, and that was about the end of that. That was the way it went on, yes.
Out of the rivalry came some of the most dramatic and exciting aircraft ever to fly. Brought together into a fighting unit, they became known as the V-Force. The first of the aircraft to fly was the Vickers Type 660, making its maiden flight on May the 18th, 1951, with Mutt Summers at the controls. A month later, it was christened the Valiant, following a poll among Vickers employees to find a suitable name. The Valiant served as a replacement for the short SA-4 Sparran, which had experienced numerous delays and had not yet taken flight. It had become evident, however, that the Sparran's performance would not meet expectations. The Valiant was far from a mundane design. By the austere standards of its time, it stood as an impressive endeavor, excelling both in terms of aerodynamics and structural capability. The dimensions of the fuselage were dictated by the need to carry the H-2S radar scanner in the nose, the pressurized cabin accommodating a crew of 5, and the dimensions of the bomb bay. The airframe structure was entered on a massive backbone member extending along the top of the fuselage. The wing spars extended from the fuselage backbone, providing the Valiant with its robust shoulder-mounted wings. These wings boasted a compound sweep design, characterized by a more acute angle of sweep at the root rather than the tips. The Valiant incorporated 4 Rolls-Royce Avon turbojets, each capable of generating 6,500 pounds of thrust, nestled within the wing root area. However, one of the key innovations of the Valiant was the utilization of entirely electric systems, contributing to the aircraft's lightweight and ease of handling.
But my first flight in the Valiant at RF Gaydon, when I did the conversion, was that of size. You could tell that you were handling something much larger, but still relatively light on the controls because of things like power controls, power operated controls. And there really wasn't a great deal different in the technique. One could say that it was a larger, like a 4-engine Canberra.
The Valiant was a remarkable achievement. George Edwards had successfully persuaded the air staff that not only could he have a flying prototype of the Valiant prepared by 1951, but the production models would also be ready before the conclusion of 1953. The aligning timeline was precisely what the air staff desired, considering the broader political developments that were starting to take shape. The Berlin blockade in 1948, followed by the building of the Berlin Wall, marked the beginning of the Cold War. Soon, there would be war in Korea. Finally, the Soviets' nuclear bomb program was at an advanced stage. By 1949, they had detonated their first nuclear device, a nuclear plant of the new member. The pressure was unrelenting, but on August 30th, 1952, the next aircraft in the V-bomber series, the Avro Type 698, took its inaugural flight.
Now, with respect, the day we rolled it out, on that Saturday morning, I think it was August the 5th, I forget now, 1952, and Rowley Fault flew it, the superintendent of flying, and Rowley Fault walked out of that aircraft with just his lounge suit on and his leather helmet, just as if he was going for an afternoon's drive. When he went down the runway, he lifted it, and we thought, oh no, he's not good, and he was up. He didn't lift the undercarriage, he was airborne for 2.25 hours. Now that 2.25 hours that he was airborne, he stopped the whole of the traffic in the Manchester area. They'd never seen anything like it, because it was a great Delta bomber, They'd seen the little ones flying, but not a big one like that. They all thought they were being invaded from outer space. Their telephones were red hot, police cars were tearing about, this, that, the other, because it was all kept hush-hush. We'd kept it shut up down there. He came back, he landed it, and he just got out, and he walked, and we all clapped him, and he just raised his hand, he just walked away as if he'd just been out for an afternoon's drive in a Mini Minor. Now then, a week later, he was taking the aircraft down to Farnborough to the air show. And he took off from here again on his own. And when he got to Farnborough, he rolled it like a fighter. He got a bollocking for it, but he still rolled it. We all heard about this. We thought, oh, we can't have it, but he did. Now, 10 days later, he's going back to Woodford with it. And we knew he'd arranged to fly it back at dinner time because all the crowd were outside to watch him come in with it. This marvellous aircraft had been built at Woodford. We saw him coming. He comes over the new assembly, which is the building across the road, the assembly sheds, and he reaches the end of the boiler house. He spins it and rolls it like over the factory from one end to the other. Straightens it up in the air, shatters everything, lands it and just walks away. And he broke all the glass in the roof, cracked it. And the glass in the roof was taped up for many years till the roof was redone.
From the very beginning, the aircraft, which later became known as the Vulcan, was acknowledged as an exceedingly advanced design, excelling both in aerodynamics and as a manufacturing feat. Notably, the Type 698 had been originally conceived by Avro's chief designer, Roy Chadwick, who tragically passed away before he could learn that the Air Ministry had accepted Avro's proposal. In order to investigate the flying properties of the Delta Wing, 1/3 scale replicas were built. Designated as the 707, 2 of these aircraft were constructed to explore the flight characteristics of a Delta Wing at slow speeds, while the other 2 were built to investigate high-speed properties. Nonetheless, the pace of development within the Type 698 program was so rapid that by the time the first 707 took to the skies in 1951, metal was already being cut for the Vulcan prototype. Initially, the prototypes were equipped with 4 Rolls-Royce Avon turbojets, but it's the Bristol Olympus series of engines that have become synonymous with the Vulcan's remarkable performance. However, further test flights conducted at Boscombe Down uncovered issues with the nearly perfect delta shape. Buffeting occurred when the aircraft pulled G-forces at high altitudes, which, in the long run, could shorten the fatigue life of the aircraft structure. The solution was to incorporate a kink into the leading edge, so that the inboard sweep was reduced, whilst the output sweep was increased. This would become the standard layout for all future Vulcans, and one which made the flying Vulcan a truly unforgettable experience.
I think the combination of perhaps the installed engine power and also a technicality that the aircraft performance frequently depends on the ratio of its weight to its wing area. The more the wing area for a given weight, the tighter the aircraft can turn. Plus, the Vulcan, the sort of triangular shape, was inherently strong, which gave it, I think, probably slightly higher G limits than the other aircraft. And certainly that combination gives you the very tight turns, plus fighter-type control column, a lot of manoeuvrability. I mean, we thought it was wonderful, and just before the Falklands, we had the Victor pilots come up and train us for the tanking. And yes, of course, their first love is the Victor, and they would defend it to their dying day. But I think they were impressed by the Vulcan. They rather liked what they saw. I remember Pete standing, we did a couple of manoeuvres, and he sort of said, "Oh, can I do that again?" And we did them so many times that the fuel got a little bit low. He was really enjoying himself. Lovely aircraft.
The formidable reputation of a 4-engine jet bomber, which sounded rather fearsome, was dispelled by the Vulcan, which was, in many ways, a very good fighter in performance terms, and beautifully easy to handle, and very few, compared with the Canberra, potential malfunctions and disasters.
While the Valiant was undergoing flight trials, the third V-bomber prototype, the Victor, was nearing completion. The Victor ultimately held the distinction of being the longest-serving V-bomber, remaining in service with the RAF Strike Command until 1993. It was also the first heavy bomber to go supersonic.
So we did another run and went to about the same indicated Mach number, and that was it. And there were no handling problems. Everything worked perfectly normally. The whole airplane was smooth without any shaking. There was no evidence of exceeding Mach 1 in terms of trim changes or anything at all. The whole thing was perfectly smooth. And we returned to Radlett. And when I got back, I went into the control tower to see the air traffic controller, and I said, "You didn't happen to hear a supersonic bang at about 20 past 11 this morning, did you?" "No." So I asked 1 or 2 others around. No, nobody, didn't seem to occur to anybody. So that was that. But on Monday morning, we discovered, this was a Saturday, in fact, we were doing this. On Monday morning, we discovered that there had been a good supersonic bang all over Watford and 1 or 2 other places. And it so happened that Charles Joy, the chief designer at Handley Page, had been shopping in Watford, and he'd witnessed it, and he knew what the time was. And the time coincided precisely. And so there was no argument. But, of course, the aerodynamicists immediately took all our records and this, that, and the other off the aeroplane and analyzed them and said, yep, it was supersonic.
As early as 1945, Sir Frederick Handley Page recognized that the RAF would need a jet bomber to replace the Lincolns. Consequently, he directed his design team to begin work on a bomber design. During 1946, the design was developed into a formal proposal. At the time, there was very little data available about the flying characteristics of a delta wing, and it was thought that such a design would be rendered unworkable due to stability problems. As a compromise, Handley Page opted for the crescent wing shape.
With the crescent wing, what happens is that the inner part of the wing, close to the fuselage, is the thickest part. It houses the engines and all the structure to carry the rest of the wing. And as the wing moves out, away from there, you can let it get thinner. So you achieve your high Mach number characteristics on the inboard section of the wing by sweeping it heavily. As you progress outboard, where the wing gets thinner, to achieve the same high Mach number characteristic, you don't need to sweep it so much. And so in the case of the Victor, there was high sweep inboard, and then that cut off in 2 stages out towards the tip. So the tips were not anything like as swept back as the rest of the leading edge of the wing, or the inboard part of the leading edge. And this achieved similar high-speed characteristics right across the wing. Didn't help the low-speed handling, but it was good for high speed, and that's what was needed.
By April 1948, the design had been refined sufficiently for a contract for 2 prototypes to be built. The Victor, as it was officially named, was set to be equipped with 4 Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire turbojets, each capable of producing 7,500 pounds of thrust. Similar to the Valiant and the Vulcan, these engines were embedded deep within the wing roots. The initially introduced wingtip fins were eventually eliminated, and, following guidance from the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, the tailplane was relocated from its mid-position to the top of the vertical fin. The tailplane was a huge fixed section, with a pair of large elevators. Its span was just 11 inches shorter than the wingspan of the Hawker Hunter. To explore the characteristics of their design still further, Handley Page decided to construct a piloted flying model, the HP-88. The exercise proved to be almost pointless, as the Victor program continued independently of the smaller research vehicle. The Victor was not only aerodynamically advanced, but also pushed the boundaries of manufacturing expertise. Its construction employed a honeycomb sandwich structure, which was either riveted or spot welded to the wing and fuselage frames. Not only was this immensely strong, but also very light. The first prototype was assembled at Radlett in anticipation that this is from where the Victor would make its first flight. The Ministry of Supply, however, expressed concerns about the runway's length, and instead that the aircraft be transported to Buscombe Down, camouflaged to resemble a boat. With utmost secrecy, the Victor was assembled and prepared for its inaugural flight.
We didn't know anything about it until B Squadron's hangar, which was the one that I was working from, had to have a lot of space cleared in it suddenly. And we didn't really know why, but on the Monday morning when we came to work, we discovered the reason was that it was full of chunks of Victor, and that people were busily, even almost immediately, starting to put this thing back together. And yes, the whole thing was still terribly hush-hush, but then the whole of Boscombe Down was, everything was sworn to secrecy. You weren't allowed to go outside the place and talk about it, but you could talk about it inside the place. They couldn't stop us. It was in our hangar, and we began to see this thing being built. And it was really quite a revolutionary affair, I can tell you, in those days, for a big aeroplane. I mean, swept wing aeroplanes were about for small ones, but for a big aeroplane, this really looked quite fantastic. And then we saw the outer wings put on with these great chunks of nose flap hanging down. That looked quite extraordinary in those days.
Then, on Christmas Eve in 1952, favorable conditions aligned, and the Victor made its maiden flight, piloted by Chief Test Pilot Squadron Leader Hedley George Hazelden. The Victor flew as well as it looked, and in the years that followed would leave an indelible impression on all who flew it.
Well, once again, not unlike the Valiant, it was immediately a super piece of equipment to fly and comfortable, and you felt at home with it straight away. And fairly soon after I started flying it, I was able to take it to high altitude, and I quite early on had it up to 50,000 feet without any trouble, much more easily than I'd ever had anything else up to that height. And the only previous aeroplane I'd had that high was a Canberra in Boscombe Down days. And it got there much more easily. And the other great thing about it was that its Mach number capability was so good, it didn't have any, or at least any apparent compressibility problems at any Mach number up to about 0.93, which was really going some in those days, because most aeroplanes were getting into trouble around 0.82 Mach number.
On the 15th of July 1953, the Victor made its public debut at the Queen's Coronation Review at Odeum. As wave after wave of aircraft flew past in salute, the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth must have marveled at the strength and power of her air force. In the near future, the meteors and vampires would make way for Hawker Hunters and English Electric Lightnings, enhancing the country's aerial defense capabilities. The Washingtons would be returned to America within months, as Britain now had laid the foundation for a modern jet bomber force that could stand toe-to-toe with any other in the world. All that was needed now was a nuclear weapon to guarantee Britain's status as a superpower. The assumption that it would be an American nuclear bomb had been abruptly cut short in 1947, when the US passed the Atomic Energy Act as proposed by Senator McMahon. The act prohibited any further cooperation with Britain over atomic research, despite the role played by British scientists in building the first American atom bomb. Driven by America's isolationist policy, Britain found itself compelled to develop its own nuclear arsenal. On October 11, 1956, a Valiant aircraft successfully released a 10,000-pound Blue Danube freefall bomb over Maralinga in Australia. The subsequent year marked a significant milestone for Britain, as it conducted its first thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb test, dropping it 400 miles off Christmas Island in the Pacific as part of the Operation Grapple tests. The third of these drops produced Britain's first megaton detonation. Britain's place at the superpower table was now assured, and America keen to rebuild a special relationship.
The aircraft was painted in a special anti-thermal flash paint. There were no black dielectric covers for the radar components on the outside. This was all, and even the flying controls, the seals on the flying controls were all made of a special anti-radiation neoprene material. The other item of equipment which was very essential was we had to black out the whole of the crew cabin. And so at a certain time prior to the bombing run, all the blackout screens went up, so the whole cabin was sealed. The only small slot was immediately in front of the captain on the left-hand side, which was a very heavily smoked glass screen, a matter of 3 or 4 inches by 1 inch or so, very small slot. Now, on the explosion of the weapon, we felt this in the form of 2 shock waves. The first one was the immediate air blast, and this affected our instruments in that the vertical speed indicator went to full-scale deflection, i.e. 4,000 feet a minute down, and then settled back again to 0. The second shock was the reflected ground wave several seconds later, and it did shake the aircraft, there was no doubt. It was quite a thump that we felt. By this time, we were going away from the explosion. We had our tail towards it, having completed an escape maneuver. And this escape maneuver involved turning through, I think, about 135 degrees and pulling an exact amount of G. We had a very accurate accelerometer fitted, and I believe it was something in the order of about 1.7 G. Not a lot, but at that amount of G, we could guarantee to have completed the escape maneuver. And so immediately we had completed the escape maneuver, down came the blackout screens. And there we were able to see the results of our efforts. This huge mushroom cloud way up into the stratosphere.
The initial Vulcan B-1 aircraft entered squadron service with number 83 Squadron, stationed at Waddington in July 1957. In April of the subsequent year, number 10 Squadron, based at Cottesmore, became the first operational squadron to receive the Victor B-1, thus completing the V-Force.
It was very exciting. I think that's more the word. Thinking back, I suppose we did feel that we were entering a new era in operational flying.
There was a great air of expectation and pride at being selected to fly these new bombers. One considered oneself in the elite, if you like.
It had become apparent for some time that delivering a free-fall bomb to any Soviet target would be an extremely perilous endeavor, given the rapid advancements in Soviet defense capabilities. The answer lay in standoff weapons, missiles which could fly themselves to the target after being launched from an aircraft. In March 1956, Avro was awarded the contract to build the Blue Steel. Blue Steel was 35 feet long and carried a red thermonuclear warhead that used rocket propulsion and had a range of 100 miles. A Valiant B-1 was used in the early trials, which despite some initial setbacks, would extend it to other V-bombers. By 1963, Blue Steel was ready to go into service. Nonetheless, the development of the Mark II version was already underway, promising significantly extended range. Progress on this version was slow, but it was eventually cancelled in favor of the American Douglas Skybolt, scheduled to replace the Blue Steel missile in 1965. However, it became apparent that the Victors could not carry the Skybolt missile. Consequently, Avro initiated the adaptation of 72 Vulcans for this purpose. These modified Vulcans, designated as the new Mark IIs, entered into service in December 1960. These aircraft had a more powerful engine, the operated 16,000-pound Olympus, which could push the Vulcan up to Mach 0.98. An enlarged wing which gave it an improved service ceiling of 55,000 feet, as well as a host of new electronic countermeasure equipment. But the RAF's plans went awry in November 1962, when President Kennedy canceled the Skybolt.
The problem with Skybolt is it's the most sophisticated weapon imaginable. We put $500 million into it already. To fire a missile from a plane moving at high speed.
After extensive diplomatic and political negotiations, President Kennedy agreed to allow the British to acquire the submarine-launched Polaris missile system. The timetable for the demise of Britain's airborne nuclear deterrent was set. In the interim, Bomber Command would persist with the Blue Steel missile and free-fall bombs. By 1963, NATO had established its response policy to counter the Soviet threat. The primary responsibility for strategic deterrence was entrusted to the formidable American Boeing B-52s under Strategic Air Command. They were supported by batteries of medium-range and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Europe's contribution to the nuclear deterrent rested solely with the V-Force. A tripwire policy meant that any Soviet aggression would be countered by a massive nuclear strike. This meant that the British bomber crews were always on instant readiness. Quick Reaction Alert, or QRA, was designed to disperse the aircraft to airfields around the UK. At these bases, the air crews would reside either in readiness huts adjacent to their aircraft or inside the aircraft themselves.
Life was fairly tedious. There's no getting away from that. You sat around for 24 hours or went to sleep in a caravan, waiting for the whistle to blow. But it was an opportunity to do other things. Of course, you did quite a bit of target study while you were on QRA. And that was simply sort of locking yourself away in a secure room and getting your target material out and working on that.
Essentially then you would deploy the aircraft to wherever, set yourself up, and you'd end up with 4 aircraft on the ORP, fully fueled, weapons as required, not nuclear weapons for a dispersal obviously, and we'd be plugged into what they called the telescramble, which if you like was a phone all the way back to Bomber Command. The crews would be sitting in, we had little caravans that were taken around if there was no purpose-built accommodation, and you'd sit there, and in the background, I always remember, you'd have this beep about every 10-15 seconds, which was just to prove that the line to Bomber Command was still open. And then at the appropriate time, which you'd always try and second guess and usually get it wrong, there'd be a message from Bomber Command, or Strike Command as it became, raising the alert state. Now the normal alert state was called Readiness 1.5, and at Readiness 1.5 that meant you were in flying kit, you were in the vicinity of the aircraft in the caravans or having a meal, and 1.5 meant you had to be airborne within 15 minutes. They could then raise that to Readiness 0.5, which meant you had to be airborne within 5 minutes. So for that, you would go out to the aircraft, strap in, do some preliminary checks, but wouldn't start the engines, because if you start the engines, you're burning fuel, which of course limits the time. There was up to 0.2, which was airborne in 2 minutes. For that, you did start the engines. Of course, there's a finite time then of how long the Lords and Masters could hold you at that alert state, and the ultimate one of scramble. And the normal one for us was Readiness 0.5 would be called. A few minutes after we got into the aircraft, they would scramble us, and then everything worked extremely well. The aircraft was designed, one button, press that, all 4 engines start, the powered flying controls run up. Everything was designed to automatically snatch out the back. You didn't bother with unplugging anything, just opened the throttles and went. In theory, the number 1 aircraft went first, but if he was delayed, he'd be elbowed out of the way by the number 2. And you just went. And as soon as you're airborne, start to disperse in the air to get out of the way of any incoming missiles. And certainly, Readiness 1.5, no trouble at all. If you said scramble from Readiness 1.5, we'd be a bit upset if people weren't airborne within 6 or 7 minutes if they were living close to the aircraft. Maybe 10 minutes if they had to take a transport. It was good. It was practice regular. It worked.
Traditionally, V-bomber operations and crew training had focused on flying at high altitudes and launching missiles from there. However, in May 1960, new evidence regarding the development of Soviet missiles came to light. Then, an American U-2 spy plane, piloted by Gary Powers, was shot down by a surface-to-air missile shot over Soviet territory at a height of 65,000 feet. A full 10,000 feet higher than the operational ceiling of the V-bombers. This, together with the cancellation of Skybolt, effectively signaled the end of high-level operations. Over the following 3 years, procedures were overhauled to shift operations to low-level flying. Initially, flights were conducted at 1,000 feet above ground level, and eventually, when conditions permitted, they could go as low as 50 feet above the ground.
One of the beauties of the Vulcan was, of course, it was extremely responsive on the controls. It handled more like a fighter. You even had a fighter stick, even though great big wheel. So the low-level operation didn't actually cause much of a problem.
Although Blue Steel could be launched at low level, new methods had to be advised for freefall bombs. This led to the use of the Labs maneuver, which exploited the handling characteristics of the V-Force aircraft to the full.
In the show in 1958, we demonstrated a low-level run across the runway, pulling the aircraft up into a half loop and rolling it off the top. And the excuse for doing this was, yes, it's a demonstration of a Labs maneuver. The whole maneuver was done entirely inside service limits for the aeroplane. We didn't exceed the service limits at all. We used the maximum speed that the aircraft will be cleared to service for, which was 360 knots. And in the loop, or the half loop, we pulled 2G, which was also inside the service limits. Rolling the aircraft off the top, of course, doesn't exceed anything. It's an entirely 1G maneuver. And so, okay, it just made something good to look at Farnborough for a big aeroplane to do. You you could only do it if the cloud was reasonably clear, because we went into the bottom of this thing at about 500 feet and over the top at about 8,000 feet.
But there was to be a trust. Flying at low altitudes posed challenges due to the denser air and increased turbulence, which placed greater stress on the aircraft's structure. This stress would inevitably reduce the aircraft's operational lifespan, and the Valiant was the first to experience these effects. Having flown low-level operations for Strategic Air Command Force for 2 years, already the Valiants began to show alarming structural problems. In December 1964, a routine examination of one Valiant showed fatigue cracks in the main spar. A rapid checking of all the other aircraft revealed the same problem. There was no alternative but to ground the whole fleet of Valiants from early 1965.
We heard all about this, the famous incident at Gaydon, where one of the flying instructors was flying a sortie, and there was a tremendous crack, and one of the spars on the right wing, I think it was, actually broke. They were able to reduce speed, fly back to Gaydon, RAF Gaydon, near Leamington Spa, and the crack was so bad that in fact it disconnected the drive to the right, to the starboard flap. So one flap came down and the other didn't. And so the captain very quickly realized that this was, and so he rolled his flaps back in again, because obviously the aircraft was starting to roll quite badly. And they landed this aircraft. He did a magnificent job of getting it down onto the runway, flapless. When the crew stepped out, they all walked round to the right-hand side, and they saw daylight through the wing root of where the starboard wing was joined. And that's how lucky that crew were.
The grounding of the Valiants carried a touch of irony, because even before the first production of B-1s had been delivered, a specialized low-level B-2 version had been constructed. This B-2 version was ordered during a period when Bomber Command believed there was a need for a Pathfinder force. However, it was soon cancelled when it became evident that dropping nuclear bombs did not necessitate such a high degree of accuracy. Had it entered operational service, it could have potentially rendered the Mark II versions of the Vulcan and Victor redundant, following the decision to transition to low-level operations. The grounding of the Valiants and the transfer of the nuclear deterrent of the Navy at some point in the future did mean there was a need to reorganize the way in which the V-Force functioned. Admittedly, there were some cutbacks in order. The Mark II Victor, equipped with the mighty Rolls-Royce Conway engines, was the first to suffer when almost half the order was cancelled, leaving the RAF with only 34 of them.
When the Mark II came along, yes, that was absolutely superb, the amount of power we had. The original Conway 11 wasn't the definitive engine for the aircraft. The definitive engine was the Conway 17, I think I'm getting my numbers right, and it delivered 20,500 pounds of thrust. And that flew just about a year later, and subsequently they all had the big Conways in them. That really gave the aeroplane some oomph. For instance, you could sit a Mark II Victor on the end of the runway, and provided that the radar air traffic controllers would give you a clear climb out, open up the power against the brakes, and at about 85% power, the airplane was going to move anyway. It wouldn't hold it. The brakes didn't slip. It was just dragging it along the ground on the tires. So you didn't let it do that. At the moment it started to want to move, let go of the brakes, hit full power, and from the moment of letting the brakes go, you could consistently have that aircraft out of 20,000 feet in 2 minutes and 8 seconds, and up to 40,000 feet in 8 minutes. Now, for an aeroplane of this size, this was really performance, without a doubt.
But the V-Force would continue for 3 major reasons. Firstly, TSR-2 had been cancelled, with no credible replacement in sight. It was left to the Vulcan to maintain the RAF's strike capability. Furthermore, NATO exerted pressure on the British government to retain the V-bombers as tactical strike aircraft to counter the formidable Warsaw Pact ground forces in Central Europe. Additionally, in-flight refueling techniques had been refined during the 1950s, utilizing Valiants as tankers. The ability to refuel in flight greatly extended the reach of the RAF, enabling it to give up bases in some of the more far-flung reaches of the globe. Fighter Command had also come to rely on in-flight refueling to extend the range of its frontline aircraft. When the Lightning aircraft entered into service, it had an endurance of just over 40 minutes, which made it an impractical proposition for extended operations without the capability to refuel. However, with consistent refueling from tanker aircraft, these planes could essentially fly for extended durations. Following the retirement of the Valiants, this refueling role was assumed by the Victors. Almost immediately, every available Mark I was converted. The first 6 were equipped with 2 retractable refueling hoses in pods under the wings. The next 25 had a third hose, fitted into the bomb bay. By the end of 1966, 3 squadrons were fully operational as tankers. In 1968, the Victor was withdrawn from the bomber force altogether, because of the impending delivery of the Polaris to the Royal Navy, and because of the uncertain future of Handley Page aircraft. Ironically, the contract to convert the remaining B-2s to K-2 tankers was awarded to Avro. The extensive reach of the V-Force was vividly showcased during the Falklands War in 1982, when Vulcans, refueled by Victors, undertook the longest bombing mission in history.
Part of the deal of the Vulcan is a threat. And we've made it clear that we physically had the ability to bomb the Argentinian mainland. So the Argentinian Air Force had to reserve a fair proportion of its fighters to defend the homeland. This means that when they put their A4s in against the fleet, they essentially were going in unescorted. And the aircraft that could have been there and interfering with the operations and taking out the Harriers were being held back to defend the mainland. Again, one of the contributions that the Vulcan made.
By that time, the Vulcan was already being phased out and replaced by the Tornado GR-1. Additionally, the RAF had Buccaneers at its disposal, capable of conducting low-level bombing missions equipped with cutting-edge weapon guidance technology. But neither aircraft could carry sufficient payload that distance. Preparing the Vulcans had to be carried out in record time.
We trained at 43,000 feet and 500 feet. It was such an unusual thing that when they were looking for statistical figures to work out bomb dropping, they actually had to go back to the B-29 missions over North Korea during the Korean War. That was the last time medium-level bombing had been done. We didn't have tables for those kind of... A lot of things had to be dug up. And in fact, the Vulcans, of course, were going out of service. As we were bombing over the Falklands, they were breaking up Vulcans at Waddington. And a lot of the equipment that we were carrying down with us had actually been rescued from the scrapheap. There were people who had never done 1,000-pound bombing in their lives before. And again, we had to find one of the very, very experienced nav radars who was briefing people on kit that, of course, had been his life in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But he never thought he was going to be trotting this information out in the 80s. Never throw anything away. You never know when you might need it.
A total of 11 Victor tankers were required for each mission, with each Vulcan bomber being refueled 5 times on the outbound journey and once on the return trip. The Victors themselves needed to be refueled 10 times to support this operation. The pilot for the second sortie was Squadron Leader John Reeve, who recounted,
"There was very little radar activity, quite frankly, over the islands. We cast off at about 250 miles north of the islands and dropped down to low level. And again, no one was for one moment doubting that the Argentinians were a fairly professional force. I mean, their pilots are as good as anyone, no suggestion there. But what we felt was, if you're going to intercept an aircraft at night, an awful lot of things have got to go right. And they've got to go right on a very technical level. And while I had no doubt about the Argentinian pilots, we were not convinced that the Argentinian conscript technicians could necessarily, do the little technical things, make sure the generator's at exactly the right frequency so the radar picture is perfect, that the radar is correctly set up. And certainly when we went in very low level to avoid the radar. We then climbed up to about 14,000 feet and bombed from that height, which was above the effective range of their light anti-aircraft guns. It also had the advantage that the bombs, when dropped, would strike the runway nearly vertically, so there was no possibility of them bouncing off. They would penetrate well through and blow up in the subsoil and really heave the runway up. So we were not picked up by the radar, and to some extent I'm not surprised in that to operate a radar on the Falklands 24 hours a day in those conditions is not easy. I'm not sure the very finest Argentinian troops were put ashore, and we felt by day I'd have been very, very wary of going. But by night, when everything's got to be a technical thing, we felt we were in with a reasonable chance.
However, this mission marked the final significant operational use of the Vulcan, and in 1984, these aircraft were retired from active service. Then, in 1992, it too made its last appearance. The Victor was the last of the V-Force to leave RAF service. Serving well into the 1990s, the Victor aircraft played a crucial role in the Gulf War, providing invaluable refueling support not only to RAF aircraft, but also to those of numerous coalition partners. Alongside 10 VC-10s and TriStars, the 7 Victors took their share of 299 sorties in just 42 days, helping to deliver 13,000 tons of fuel to the first strike aircraft. For 38 years, the skies of Britain shuddered under the noise of these great four-jet engine bombers. As conventional bombers, nuclear carriers, and tankers, they performed their tasks with style and grace. Indeed, these aircraft, designed to fulfill the demands of the Cold War era, stand as a testament to the pinnacle of aviation design. The question of whether the airborne nuclear deterrent was justified remains as a matter of debate, but history does suggest its significance. It has not only served as a crucial component of Britain's defense strategy, but also provided a compelling reason for the United States to maintain a close relationship with Britain, ultimately contributing to the safety and security of Western Europe for 4 decades. As to the cost, one should heed the words of Sir Frederick Henry Page when he said, "Nobody has ever won a war by trying to run it on the cheap. Nothing is so expensive as losing them. By saving money, if you want the cheapest possible air force today, it is very easy to standardize on a whole lot of aircraft which will be of no use when a war comes."